What if your family vanished from a place that was supposed to be safe? A place filled with laughter, hot chocolate, and the rush of fresh powder snow? In 2007, that nightmare became reality for Jakob Lightner, owner of the Silver Fir ski resort in Colorado. His wife Analisa and their 10-year-old daughter Lena disappeared without a trace during what should have been an ordinary weekend ski trip. For 7 years, this cold case haunted a mountain community, baffling investigators and breaking a father's heart. Every lead went nowhere. Every search turned up nothing. The questions multiplied while the answers remained buried beneath layers of snow and secrets. But then, in 2014, hikers stumbled upon something in a restricted zone. A small red hoodie and a distinctive jacket, half buried in debris. These items would crack open one of Colorado's most disturbing cold cases, leading to an arrest so shocking that it would shake the foundations of this tight-knit ski town. This is a story about a father who refused to stop searching, about a community that thought it knew everyone, and about evil hiding in plain sight, wearing a friendly smile and a ski instructor's badge. What really happened to Analisa and Lena Lightner? And how did it take 7 years to discover that the answer had been right there all along, walking the same snowy trails, teaching children to ski, living among them as if nothing had ever happened? The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Let me introduce you to the Lightner family, the beating heart of Silver Fir, Colorado. Jakob Lightner wasn't born into the ski resort business. He built it from the ground up, transforming a struggling mountain lodge into one of Colorado's hidden gems. Friends described him as a dreamer with dirt under his fingernails, the kind of man who could fix a broken ski lift in the morning and charm guests over dinner in the evening. But the real magic of Silver Fir came from Analisa. Analisa Lightner, 34 years old, managed the resort's hospitality operations. Staff members remember her infectious laugh echoing through the lodge's great room. She had this way of remembering everyone's name, everyone's story. Guests would return year after year not just for the powder, but for Analisa's warm welcome and her legendary cinnamon rolls served fresh every morning in the main dining hall. She'd grown up in Denver, the daughter of immigrant parents who'd worked 3 jobs to give her opportunities. Analisa never forgot where she came from. During the off-season, she organized charity ski days for underprivileged kids from the city, believing that every child deserved to experience the freedom of gliding down a mountain. And then there was Lena, 10 years old, with her mother's bright smile and her father's adventurous spirit. Lena was that kid who knew every employee by name, who'd pop into the kitchen to steal cookies, who'd challenge adult skiers to races down the bunny slopes and somehow make them feel like they'd accomplished something by keeping up with her. Her 4th-grade teacher, Mrs. Patricia Holloway, described Lena as an old soul. She had this empathy that you don't often see in children, Patricia would later tell investigators. If someone was sitting alone at lunch, Lena would be right there, making them feel included. She wanted to be a veterinarian, specifically to help injured wild animals in the mountains. Lena kept a journal, a purple notebook with stickers of snowflakes and mountain goats covering the front. In it, she'd write about her adventures, the animals she'd spotted, her dreams of one day running the resort with her parents. That journal was found in room 306, the last place Lena and Analisa were seen alive by anyone who cared about them. The resort wasn't just their business. It was their home, their community, their entire world. Jakob had purchased the property in 2002, when Lena was just 5 years old. Back then, it was barely functional. Outdated lifts, a lodge that leaked when it rained, slopes that hadn't been properly maintained in years. But Jakob saw potential. More importantly, he saw a place where he could raise his daughter surrounded by nature, by good people, by the kind of life he'd always dreamed about. Analisa had been skeptical at first. Moving from Denver to a remote mountain town meant leaving behind her family, her friends, the safety net of city life. But Jakob's enthusiasm was contagious, and truthfully, she'd fallen in love with the place the moment she saw it. The way the morning sun hit the peaks, the absolute silence of a mountain evening, the promise of building something together. Those 5 years had been magical. The resort flourished under their care. They hired locally, creating jobs in a community that desperately needed them. They became fixtures at town council meetings, at the local school, at every community potluck and fundraiser. Silver fur wasn't just their business. It was their gift to the community, and the community gave back that love tenfold. Analisa had a best friend, Rebecca Torres, who managed the resort's rental shop. Rebecca would later tell investigators that the week before the disappearance, Analisa had been excited, talking about plans to expand the lodge, to add a spa, to create summer programming that would turn Silver Fir into a year-round destination. She was so full of life, Rebecca said, her voice breaking. There was no indication anything was wrong. No signs of trouble. She was making plans for the future, for Lena's birthday party in March, for a family trip to visit her parents in April. These weren't the plans of someone who was about to vanish. Lena, too, had been her normal, bubbly self. Her last day at school, the Friday before that fateful weekend, she'd given a presentation about avalanche safety, complete with hand-drawn posters and a dramatic reenactment. Her classmates laughed and cheered. Her teacher gave her an A+. That evening, Jakob remembered, they'd had dinner together in the lodge's private quarters. Homemade pasta, Lena's favorite. They talked about the weekend ahead, about how much fun it would be to ski together as a family. Jakob had a rare weekend off from managing the resort, and they were all looking forward to it. I can still hear her voice, Jakob would later say in interviews. She was telling me about this snow fort she wanted to build near the intermediate trails. She wanted it to be big enough that we could all fit inside. She was so excited. Her eyes were shining. That's the last real conversation I had with my daughter. I didn't know it would be 7 years before I'd hear her voice again. The Lightners represented everything good about small mountain communities. Hard work, generosity, love for the land and for each other. They were living the dream that so many people chase but never quite catch. And then, in one weekend, that dream shattered into a million pieces, scattered across the snow like broken glass. February 9th, 2007. A Saturday morning that started like any other at Silver Fir Ski Resort. The weekend had been planned for months. Analisa and Lena were going to spend Friday and Saturday night at the resort, staying in room 306, one of the premium guest rooms with a view of the main slopes. It was something they did occasionally, treating the resort like their personal vacation spot, giving them a chance to experience what guests experienced. Jakob was supposed to join them, but a burst pipe in the lodge's main kitchen kept him busy Friday night. He told them to go ahead, enjoy the slopes, and he'd catch up with them Saturday afternoon once the repairs were complete. Friday evening, Analisa called him around 7 p.m. Everything was fine. They'd had dinner at the lodge restaurant. Lena had made friends with another young girl staying with her family. They were planning to hit the slopes early Saturday morning before the crowds arrived. "I love you," Analisa said before hanging up. Those were the last words Jakob heard from his wife. Saturday morning came and went. Jakob, still dealing with the kitchen crisis, sent text messages. No response. He called. Straight to voicemail. He wasn't immediately worried. Cell service on the mountain was spotty. They were probably out on the slopes, phones tucked away in lockers, having too much fun to check messages. But by Saturday evening, concern crept in. Still no response. He called the front desk, asked them to check room 306. The desk clerk, a young man named Danny Ortiz, went up personally. The room was undisturbed. Danny would later tell police. Beds were made. Their ski gear was laid out on the chairs like they'd been planning to use it. Analisa's purse was on the nightstand. Lena's purple journal was on the bed. But no one was there. Danny knocked on neighboring rooms, asked if anyone had seen them. Nothing. He checked the dining hall, the ski rental shop, the main lodge areas. No sign of Analisa or Lena Lightner. That's when he called Jakob back. Jakob arrived at room 306 within 20 minutes. His heart pounding with a dread he couldn't quite name. When he opened the door and saw their belongings, Analisa's favorite sweater draped over the back of a chair, Lena's stuffed mountain goat tucked carefully into the pillows, the world tilted sideways. People don't just leave everything behind. Not like this. He checked the parking lot. Their car was still there, covered in a fresh dusting of snow, clearly hadn't been moved. Their ski passes were still in the room, hanging on the key hook by the door. Everything they would need to ski, to leave, to do anything, it was all still there. But Analisa and Lena were gone. Jakob's first thought was the slopes. Maybe there'd been an accident. Maybe they'd gotten turned around, ended up in a closed section, were waiting somewhere for help. The mountain could be dangerous, especially for those who wandered off-trail. He immediately organized a search party. Resort staff, guests, locals from town. Within an hour, more than 50 people were combing the slopes, calling out their names, checking every trail, every building, every warming hut. By Sunday morning, the search had grown to over 200 people. The local police had been called in. Search and rescue teams arrived with dogs trained to find people buried in avalanches. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the vast white landscape for any sign of two missing people. But the mountain was silent. No tracks, no disturbed snow, no pieces of clothing or equipment. Nothing. The most baffling detail? The timing. Security logs showed that Analisa and Lena had used their room key to enter room 306 Friday evening at 6:45 p.m. The door was never opened again, at least not with the keycard. The electronic lock system would have recorded it. Yet at some point between Friday night and Saturday afternoon, they had left that room. The question was how and with whom. The hallway outside room 306 had one security camera, positioned at the far end near the elevator. Police reviewed the footage. Friday evening, they could see Analisa and Lena entering their room, waving at the camera, Lena doing a silly dance. It was heartbreaking to watch. So normal, so innocent. But after that, nothing. The camera never caught them leaving. There was a service stairwell, but it was supposed to be locked from the hallway side, only accessible with a staff keycard. Yet when police checked, they found it unlocked. Had it been left open by mistake? Or had someone deliberately unlocked it? The window in room 306 was closed and locked from the inside. It was 3 stories up, impossible to exit that way without specialized equipment. It was as if they'd simply dissolved into thin air. Detective Sarah Chun from the Denver Police Department was assigned as lead investigator. She'd seen a lot in her 15 years on the force, but this case immediately struck her as wrong. Very wrong. The scene was too clean, Detective Chun would later explain. When people disappear from a place like this, especially in winter, there's usually some indication of where they went. Footprints in the snow. A witness who saw them heading toward the parking lot. Something. But here, it was like they'd been erased. The investigation expanded rapidly. Every guest who'd been staying at the resort that weekend was interviewed. Every staff member was questioned. Every vehicle that had entered or left the resort property was accounted for. Theories emerged and crumbled just as quickly. Theory 1. They'd gone hiking and gotten lost. But why would they go hiking without proper gear, without telling anyone, without their phones? And why wouldn't the search dogs pick up any scent trail? Theory 2. They'd left voluntarily, perhaps escaping some unknown threat. But everything they owned was still in that room. No money was missing from their accounts. And most damning, Analisa would never, ever leave Jakob without a word. Their marriage was solid, their life was good. Friends were unanimous in this assessment. Theory 3, abduction. But who, how, and why? And how could someone abduct 2 people from a busy ski resort without a single witness? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained maddeningly out of reach. By the end of the first week, the search area had expanded to cover over 50 square miles of mountainous terrain. Volunteers were exhausted. The weather was turning worse, with a massive storm system moving in that would dump 3 feet of snow on the region. Jakob barely slept. He coordinated searches during the day and stayed up all night making posters, calling every contact he had, begging for help from anyone who would listen. The resort remained open. Bills still needed to be paid, staff still needed their jobs, but it felt like a ghost town, haunted by the absence of the 2 people who'd made it feel like home. The community rallied in ways that would later become crucial to the case. A volunteer named Marcus Williams organized a system where locals would take turns maintaining the search effort even as professional teams began to scale back. Rebecca Torres set up a tip line and fielded hundreds of calls. most leading nowhere, but each one given serious attention. The local newspaper, the Silver Fir Gazette, ran daily updates. Lena's school held vigils. Churches across 3 counties prayed for their safe return. But as February turned into March, and March into April, hope began to fade like footprints in melting snow. Detective Chun refused to give up, but she also had to face the statistical reality. The longer someone stayed missing, especially in winter mountain conditions, the less likely they were to be found alive. The case wasn't officially declared cold. Not yet. But the active investigation was winding down, resources being redirected to other cases, other emergencies, other families in crisis. For Jakob Lightner, though, it would never wind down. Not until he had answers. Not until he found his family. The initial investigation into the disappearance of Analisa and Lena Lightner was one of the most intensive search operations in Colorado history. But despite the massive effort, investigators kept hitting walls that, in hindsight, had been deliberately constructed. Detective Sarah Chen assembled a task force that included local police, county sheriffs, FBI agents specializing in missing persons, and search and rescue experts. They worked around the clock for the first 30 days, following every possible lead, no matter how small. The first major lead came from a guest named Harold Pemberton, a retiree from Texas who'd been staying at Silver Fir that weekend with his wife. Harold reported seeing a man carrying what looked like ski equipment and a large duffel bag to the parking lot late Friday night, around 11 p.m. The man had seemed nervous, looking over his shoulder repeatedly. "I thought it was odd," Harold told investigators. "Most folks don't load up their gear that late. And the way he was moving, like he didn't want to be seen, it stuck with me." Police showed Harold photos of every male staff member and guest. He couldn't make a positive identification. The lighting had been poor, and Harold's eyesight wasn't what it used to be. The lead went nowhere, but Detective Chen filed it away. Something about it felt important. The second lead involved a credit card transaction. On Saturday morning at 9:15 a.m., someone used a card registered to Analisa Lightner at a gas station in Leadville, about 40 miles from Silver Fir. Security footage showed a man in a heavy winter jacket and ski mask using the card at the pump. His build, his height, nothing was distinctive enough for a solid identification. When investigators dug deeper, they found the card itself still in Analisa's purse back in room 306. How had someone used a card that never left the resort? The answer was chilling. A skimmer or a copied number. Someone had access to Analisa's financial information and was deliberately creating false trails to mislead investigators. Detective Chun brought in a forensic team to process room 306. They dusted every surface for fingerprints, collected DNA samples, searched for any sign of struggle or foul play. The room yielded dozens of fingerprints. No surprise, given that it was a hotel room used by countless guests over the years. But none of the prints matched anyone in the criminal database. DNA samples were collected and cataloged, but without a suspect to compare them to, they were just data points floating in the void. The most heartbreaking discovery was Lena's journal. Investigators read every page, looking for any clue about what might have happened. The entries were typical of a 10-year-old, complaints about homework, excitement about skiing, descriptions of animals she'd seen on the trails. But there was one entry from the Thursday before they disappeared that caught Detective Chen's attention. "Mr. Matias taught me a new skiing trick today. He said I'm his best student ever. He gave me a special patch for my jacket. Mom says he's really nice and I should listen to him because he knows the mountain better than anyone. Mr. Matias Brandt. Ski instructor, longtime employee, trusted friend of the Lightner family." Detective Chun and her team interviewed Matias on 3 separate occasions during those first few weeks. Each time, his story remained consistent. He'd seen Analisa and Lena Friday afternoon during a group lesson. They'd seemed happy, excited about their weekend. He'd finished his shift around 5 p.m. and gone home to his cabin about 2 miles from the resort. He lived alone. No alibi, but also no evidence connecting him to the disappearance. Matias was cooperative, even helpful. He joined the search efforts, spending hours on the mountain calling out their names. He seemed genuinely distraught, breaking down in tears during one of the searches. Several witnesses described him as devastated by the loss. Detective Chun had a gut feeling about him, something that didn't sit right, but gut feelings aren't evidence. Matias's background check came back clean. No criminal record. No complaints. He'd been working at Silver Fir for 6 years, hired by Jakob himself. Multiple parents vouched for him as an excellent instructor who was patient and professional with children. The investigation also looked into Jakob himself, a standard procedure in cases involving missing family members. Could this have been a domestic situation gone wrong? Financial problems? Insurance fraud? But every single indicator pointed to Jakob's innocence. His financials were clean. His relationship with Analisa was, by all accounts, loving and stable. His alibi for Friday night was solid. Multiple staff members confirmed he'd been dealing with the kitchen pipe issue until well after midnight. And most tellingly, his desperation to find his family was genuine. Experienced investigators can usually spot a performance, and this wasn't one. The third major lead involved tire tracks found in a restricted maintenance area of the resort, about a half-mile from the main lodge. The tracks were from a vehicle with distinctive winter tires, a specific brand and tread pattern. Records showed that 3 staff members and 12 guests had vehicles with matching tires. One by one, they were all accounted for, their movements tracked and verified. Except for one set of tracks that investigators couldn't definitively match to any specific vehicle. The snow had partially melted and refrozen, obscuring important details. This was becoming a pattern in the investigation, promising leads that dissolved into uncertainty. A psychic from Boulder reached out, claiming to have visions of Analisa and Lena in a cabin deep in the woods, alive but unable to escape. Desperate, Jakob convinced Detective Chun to at least check it out. They found several abandoned cabins in the areas the psychic described. All were empty. All had been empty for years. Tips flooded in from across the country. Someone in Oregon claimed to have seen a woman and child matching their description. A trucker in Kansas reported giving a ride to a woman who seemed scared. A clerk at a convenience store in Utah swore she'd sold snacks to Lena. Every single tip was investigated. Every single one led nowhere. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a profile of potential suspects. They were looking for someone with intimate knowledge of the resort, someone who had access to the security systems, someone who could move through the building without raising suspicion, someone who had a reason to target this specific family. The profile fit dozens of people: current staff, former staff, frequent guests, contractors who'd done work at the resort. The net was too wide. By summer, the active search operations had ceased. The official investigation continued, but the daily intensity had decreased. Resources were limited, and without new evidence, there was only so much that could be done. Detective Chun created a cold case file, but she made herself a promise. She would review this case every single month, looking for angles they'd missed, connections they hadn't made. She kept photos of Analisa and Lena on her desk, a constant reminder that these weren't just case numbers. They were people. They deserved justice. The resort struggled financially. Bookings dropped as word spread about the disappearance. Guests didn't want to vacation at a place associated with such tragedy. Staff members left, finding work at other resorts where the atmosphere wasn't heavy with grief and unanswered questions. Jakob kept the resort running through sheer will, but it was draining him. He'd aged 10 years in a few months. Friends worried he wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. He'd turned the resort's conference room into a command center, walls covered with maps, timelines, photographs, theories. Rebecca Torres, Analisa's best friend, became Jakob's anchor to reality. She'd bring him food, force him to rest, help manage the resort when he was too consumed by the investigation to function. She never stopped believing they'd find answers. Jakob would talk to me late at night, Rebecca later recalled. He'd go through every detail again and again, looking for something we missed. He was convinced the answer was right there, hidden in plain sight. He'd say, "Rebecca, someone knows what happened. Someone saw something. We just have to find that person." Local volunteers organized anniversary searches. On February 9, 2008, Exactly 1 year after the disappearance, over 100 people returned to the mountain. They covered ground that had already been searched dozens of times, hoping that the spring thaw might reveal something that winter had hidden. They found nothing. The case appeared in several true crime publications. America's Most Wanted did a segment. The publicity generated new tips, but none panned out. The leads that had seemed so promising in those first weeks, Harold Pemberton's late-night sighting, the credit card fraud, the mysterious tire tracks, all remained frustratingly inconclusive. Detective Chun consulted with experts in every relevant field. Forensic anthropologists discussed where remains might be located in mountain terrain. Behavioral psychologists analyzed potential abduction scenarios. Search and rescue specialists used probability models to predict the most likely locations if Analisa and Lena had gotten lost or injured. But every analysis came back to the same problem. There was no physical evidence. No bodies. No crime scene. No witnesses. No suspects with credible motive and opportunity. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. Matias Brandt continued working at Silver Fir. Jakob had considered firing him during those first months, not because he suspected Matias, but because seeing him was a painful reminder of that last journal entry, of the ski lessons of the time before everything fell apart. But Rebecca convinced him otherwise. If we start getting rid of everyone who knew them, everyone who reminds us of better days, there'll be no one left, she said. Besides, Matias is a good instructor. The resort needs him. So Matias stayed, and life at Silver Fir trudged forward in its diminished, haunted way. The first investigation had been thorough, professional, and utterly unsuccessful. But Detective Sarah Chun wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She'd seen cold cases break open years after going dormant. A witness who was afraid to come forward finally finds courage. A piece of technology improves and can reanalyze old evidence. A suspect makes a mistake, gets careless, leaves a trail that can finally be followed. She believed in persistence. She believed that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. She just didn't know it would take 7 years. 7 years. 2,555 days. That's how long Jakob Lightner lived in limbo, suspended between hope and despair, between the life he'd had and the nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The cold case years were perhaps the cruelest part of this story, because unlike families who receive closure, terrible as that closure might be, Jakob lived with questions that multiplied in the silence. Were they alive? Were they suffering? Were they thinking of him? Did they know he was still searching? Or were they gone? Their remains somewhere on that vast mountain, waiting to be discovered by some hiker or hidden forever beneath snow and stone. The not knowing was a special kind of torture. In 2008, the resort was barely surviving. Jakob took out loans to keep it operational, leveraging everything he owned. Rebecca Torres essentially became his business partner, though she refused any official title or compensation. She did it out of love for Analisa, out of loyalty to the family that had given her a career and a home. The resort was all Jakob had left of them, Rebecca explained years later. If Silver Fir failed, it would be like losing them all over again. We couldn't let that happen. They scaled back operations significantly. Some slopes were closed. Staff was cut to essential personnel only. The grand expansion plans that Analisa had been so excited about were shelved indefinitely. But Jakob refused to give up the search. Every spring, when the snow melted and the trails became accessible again, he organized volunteer search parties. The first year brought 100 volunteers. The second year, 50. By the 5th year, it was down to a dedicated core of about 15 people, mostly friends, a few locals who'd known Analisa and Lena and Rebecca. They'd spend weekends combing through sections of the mountain, particularly areas that had been difficult to access during winter. They'd call out names that would never be answered. They'd look for signs that had long since been scattered by wind and weather. Marcus Williams, the volunteer who'd helped organize early search efforts, never missed one of these annual searches. A retired park ranger, Marcus understood the mountain better than most. He'd tell Jakob, "The mountain keeps secrets, but eventually, it gives them up." We just have to be patient. Detective Sarah Chun kept her promise. Every month, she'd pull out the Lightner case file. She'd review witness statements, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. She'd check missing persons databases, comparing cold cases across the region, looking for patterns. In 2009, she attended a conference on cold case investigations where she learned about emerging forensic technologies, advanced DNA analysis, digital forensics, geographical profiling. She returned to Denver energized, convinced that when new evidence eventually surfaced, they'd be ready to analyze it with tools that hadn't existed in 2007. The problem was simple. They needed new evidence. Jakob maintained Lena's room in their private quarters exactly as she'd left it. Her bed was made. Her stuffed animals were arranged on her pillows. Her books were stacked on her nightstand. Friends who visited would sometimes hear him in there late at night, reading aloud from her favorite stories as if she could somehow hear him. He aged in ways that weren't just physical. His smile, when it appeared at all, never reached his eyes anymore. His laugh, something Analisa had always said was his best feature, was absent entirely. He moved through his days with mechanical efficiency, managing the resort, coordinating searches, checking in with Detective Chun, and then doing it all over again. He dated no one. Friends gently suggested that he needed to consider the possibility of moving forward with his life, but Jakob couldn't even process what that would mean. Move forward to what? Without knowing what happened to his family, there was no forward, only an endless present tense of waiting. The community never forgot. Every February 9th, the anniversary of the disappearance, the local church held a vigil. Even years later, 20 or 30 people would show up, light candles, share memories of Analisa and Lena, and pray for answers. Lena's elementary school planted a tree in her honor, a Colorado blue spruce that would grow strong and tall, even as the girl it commemorated remained frozen in time at age 10. The Silver Fir Gazette ran an update every year on the anniversary, keeping the case alive in public consciousness. Journalists would interview Jakob, who'd give the same statement with slight variations. I will never stop looking. They're out there somewhere. Someone knows what happened. If you have any information, please come forward. In 2010, 3 years after the disappearance, a hiker found human remains in a ravine about 15 miles from Silver Fir. The call came to Jakob on a Tuesday afternoon. His heart stopped. This was it, the call he'd been dreading and desperately needing at the same time. Detective Chun rushed the remains to the state forensic lab for analysis. DNA testing would take several days, but preliminary examination suggested the remains were female, approximately the right age range for Analisa. Those 3 days were among the worst of Jakob's life. The waiting, the imagining, the terrible relief of potentially having an answer warring with the horror of what that answer would mean. When the results came back, the remains were identified as a 38-year-old woman from Colorado Springs who'd gone missing on a solo hiking trip in 2008. Her family got their terrible closure. Jakob returned to his indefinite waiting. This happened twice more over the years. Remains discovered, hope and dread surging, results coming back negative. Each time left Jakob more emotionally shattered than before. By 2012, 5 years into the cold case, Detective Chun was promoted to senior detective. She had the authority to pursue cases as she saw fit, with fewer bureaucratic constraints. The Lightner case remained her white whale, the one she couldn't solve, couldn't let go of, couldn't stop thinking about. She'd built a comprehensive digital file with everything they knew. Witness statements, security footage, financial records, photographs, theories, dead ends. She'd look at it before bed, letting her subconscious work on the puzzle while she slept. She kept coming back to several nagging questions. Why was there no physical evidence of departure? People don't vanish into thin air. Who unlocked the service stairwell door? What was the significance of that late-night sighting by Harold Pemberton? Where were the bodies? Because by this point, Detective Chun had to assume they were dealing with homicides. The alternatives, that Analisa and Lena had somehow left voluntarily and stayed hidden for years, made no logical sense. And there was Matias Brandt. Something about him bothered her. Not enough for probable cause, Not enough to justify investigation that might constitute harassment, but enough that she'd periodically run his name through various databases, checking for any new information. He was clean, always clean. In 2013, 6 years after the disappearance, a true crime podcast called Mountain Mysteries did a deep dive into the Lightner case. The exposure brought renewed attention, thousands of new listeners examining the details, offering theories on online forums. The podcast hosted a call-in segment where listeners could share tips. Most were well-meaning but unhelpful misidentifications, conspiracy theories, psychic visions. But one caller, a woman named Jennifer who'd worked at Silver Fir briefly in 2006, mentioned something interesting. There was this instructor, Matias, who always gave me creepy vibes, Jennifer said. He'd ask too many questions about the guests, particularly families with young daughters. Where they were staying, how long they'd be there. I thought he was just being friendly, trying to be a good employee, but looking back, it felt off. The podcast host passed this information to Detective Chun, who interviewed Jennifer in detail. Jennifer stood by her statement but admitted she had no specific evidence of wrongdoing. It was a feeling, an impression, something that only became concerning in hindsight. Detective Chun added this to her file, another data point in the constellation of suspicions surrounding Matias Brandt. But suspicions weren't evidence. Feelings weren't proof. The cold case years also brought strange, painful moments of hope. Occasional sightings. Someone in California thought they saw a woman who looked like Analisa. A teacher in Oregon reported a student who bore resemblance to how Lena might look at 16. Each sighting was investigated. Each one was a false alarm. Jakob tried to maintain normalcy in whatever way he could. He showed up for community events. He volunteered for local causes. He kept the resort operating, even expanded slightly when the economy improved and tourists slowly started returning. But everyone who knew him could see the permanent damage. He was a ghost haunting his own life, going through motions that must have felt hollow and meaningless. Rebecca worried about him constantly. Some days I'd find him just standing in the lobby, staring at the spot where he'd last seen them walk toward the elevator, she recalled. He'd stand there for 20 minutes, just frozen, lost in whatever thoughts he was thinking. Then he'd shake himself out of it and get back to work. The annual searches continued. Spring after spring, the small group of dedicated volunteers would return to the mountain, covering miles of terrain, checking caves and ravines, looking under fallen logs and in abandoned structures. They never found anything. By 2014, 7 years had passed. The case was thoroughly cold, buried under layers of time and newer investigations. For most people in the broader community, Analisa and Lena Lightner had become a sad story, a cautionary tale, a mystery that would likely never be solved. But for Jakob, for Rebecca, for Detective Chun, and for that small group of volunteers, the case was very much alive. It breathed and pulsed and demanded attention, even as the world moved on. The mountain held its secrets close. The snow continued to fall and melt, in endless cycles of white silence. But mountains aren't perfect secret keepers. Eventually, they give things up. Rock shifts, ice recedes, trees fall and expose what was hidden beneath them. 7 years is a long time to wait. It's also nothing to a mountain. And in the spring of 2014, the mountain finally started talking. April 23, 2014. 7 years, 2 months, and 14 days after Analisa and Lena Lightner disappeared. 2 college students from the University of Colorado, Emma Rodriguez and Kyle Chen, were on an off-trail hiking adventure in a restricted section of the mountain about 3 miles from Silver Fir Resort. They were experienced hikers, but they deliberately ventured into an area marked with no trespassing signs, seeking the thrill of exploring somewhere they weren't supposed to be. It was stupid, dangerous, and it would crack open the biggest cold case in Colorado history. The area was restricted because of unstable terrain and avalanche risk. Years of snowfall and spring melts had created unpredictable conditions. Sudden sinkholes, hidden crevasses, rock slides. Smart people stayed away. But Emma and Kyle weren't thinking about danger. They were young, invincible, armed with GPS and emergency supplies. They'd been hiking for about 2 hours when Emma stopped suddenly. "Do you see that?" she called out to Kyle. Partially exposed from a small debris slide, likely caused by the recent spring thaw, was a flash of color. Bright red. Artificial. Out of place in the natural browns and grays of the exposed mountainside. They approached carefully, navigating the loose rocks and remaining snow. As they got closer, Emma's stomach dropped. It was a child's red hoodie. Small. Weathered by years of exposure to the elements, but unmistakably a piece of clothing designed for a young girl. Kyle pulled out his phone, taking photos. They didn't touch it initially, some instinct telling them this was more than just a discarded piece of clothing. Emma looked around the immediate area. About 10 feet away, partially buried under rocks and decomposed with that looked like remnants of a collapsed structure, she spotted something else. A jacket. Adult-sized. Dark blue with distinctive yellow piping on the sleeves. "Kyle, we need to call someone," Emma said, her voice shaky. They hiked back to an area with cell service and called 911. Within an hour, police were on the scene. Within 2 hours, Detective Sarah Chun was standing on that mountainside, staring at the red hoodie that had been photographed and carefully documented by the forensics team. Her heart was pounding. This could be it. After 7 years, this could be the break they desperately needed. The red hoodie was sent immediately to the forensics lab in Denver for analysis. The jacket, that distinctive blue and yellow jacket, was carefully excavated from the debris pile. Back at Silver Fir, Rebecca Torres received a call from Detective Chun. "We need Jakob to come to the station. We've found something. I can't say more over the phone, but we need him here today." Jakob arrived within an hour, his face drawn, his hands shaking. Detective Chun led him to a private room where she'd prepared photos of the items. Not the actual physical items yet, as they were still being processed, but high-resolution images. "Jakob, I need you to look at these carefully. Can you identify either of these items?" He looked at the red hoodie first. The air left his lungs. "That's Lena's. She had a hoodie exactly like that. Analisa bought it for her the Christmas before they—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Are you certain?" "Yes. See that little patch near the bottom hem? That's a souvenir patch from Rocky Mountain National Park. We went there as a family the summer of 2006. Lena sewed it on herself. She was so proud of it." Detective Chun zoomed in on the image. There it was, a small faded patch showing a mountain and forest scene. "And this jacket?" She showed him the second image. Jakob studied it carefully. I'm not sure. Could be one of the resort staff jackets, but the color and style aren't quite right. The piping is different. This looks almost custom-made. That detail would become crucial. The forensics analysis of the red hoodie confirmed what Jakob had identified. DNA recovered from inside the collar matched samples from Lena's room, hair from her brush, cells from her toothbrush. This was definitively Lena Lightner's hoodie. But the condition told a troubling story. The hoodie showed signs of extended wear, multiple repairs, areas that had been washed repeatedly. This wasn't something that had been on a body left exposed to elements for 7 years. This was something that had been worn, maintained, cared for. The jacket was even more revealing. It was a high-quality ski jacket, expensive, custom-made. The interior label had been removed, but forensic analysis found fibers and a partial label code that traced back to a specialty outdoor gear maker in Boulder. Detective Chun contacted the company. With their assistance, she learned that this particular style and color combination had been part of a limited custom order placed in 2005. Only 30 jackets had been made. The company still had records of the buyers. One name on that list made Detective Chun's blood run cold: Matias Brandt. She cross-referenced the jacket specifications with photos she had of Matias from resort promotional materials over the years. The yellow piping, the specific shade of blue, the button configuration, everything matched a jacket he'd been photographed wearing in 2006. But wearing a similar jacket wasn't proof of anything. Matias could claim he'd lost his jacket years ago, that someone else must have taken it, that this was all circumstantial. Detective Chun needed more. She needed to understand how these items ended up in that specific location, and what else might be hidden there. A full forensic team was dispatched to the site where Emma and Kyle had made their discovery. The area was treated as a potential crime scene, cordoned off, carefully excavated using techniques normally reserved for archaeological digs. What they found painted a disturbing picture. The debris pile was actually the remains of an old hunting cabin, long abandoned, that had partially collapsed under years of snow load. The structure wasn't on any current maps, likely built illegally decades ago by someone wanting a remote mountain hideout. Beneath the collapsed roof and walls, investigators found evidence of recent habitation. Not recent as in days or weeks, but recent as in years, not decades. There were food wrappers and cans with expiration dates ranging from 2007 to 2013. There were blankets, still partially preserved under the shelter of fallen timbers. There was a portable camping stove. There were books, including several children's books, the kind a parent might read to a 10-year-old. And there were chains, heavy-duty chains with padlocks, affixed to support posts that were still standing despite the roof collapse. The forensic team spent 3 days methodically processing the scene. They found DNA evidence, lots of it. They found fingerprints on the food cans and other items. They found hair samples. DNA analysis would take time, but the initial field testing was promising. They had material that could potentially match to Analisa, Lena, and whoever else had been in this cabin. But they didn't find bodies. Whatever had happened here, whatever this cabin had been used for, the occupants weren't here now. Detective Chun sat in her car on the mountain road, staring at her case notes, pieces finally clicking into place. Someone had kept Analisa and Lena in this remote cabin. Someone had brought them food, kept them chained, held them prisoner for years. Someone who knew this mountain intimately, who could navigate to this hidden location in all seasons, who could come and go without raising suspicion. Someone like a ski instructor who regularly worked alone on the mountain, who could claim to be checking trails or giving private lessons, who had legitimate reasons to be in remote areas. Someone like Matias Brandt. But why? What was the motive? And most critically, where were Analisa and Lena now? The cabin had collapsed, possibly in a winter storm within the last year or two based on the wood decay. If they'd been held there, they would have had to have been moved. But moved where? And were they even still alive? Rebecca Torres called Jacob with the news about the discovery. His reaction was complex, hope warring with horror. They'd been alive, possibly for years after the disappearance. But they'd been held captive, chained in a remote cabin. What had they endured? What were they enduring now? The media got hold of the story within 48 hours. Major break in Lightner cold case screamed the headlines. Reporters descended on Silver Fir on the mountain site on the Denver police station. Detective Chun held a carefully worded press conference. She confirmed the discovery of items belonging to the missing victims. She confirmed they were pursuing new leads. She did not name any suspects. Not yet. But in the small mountain community, word spread fast. Everyone knew about the jacket. Everyone knew Matias Brandt had been working at the resort since before the disappearance. Everyone started remembering little things that hadn't seemed important at the time. A waitress recalled how Matias would always volunteer to work weekend shifts, how he'd sometimes disappear for hours and come back with vague explanations about checking trail conditions. A maintenance worker remembered finding Matias in restricted areas of the resort basement on several occasions, always with a reasonable explanation, but in hindsight, maybe too reasonable. A former girlfriend from 2008 came forward, telling police that Matias had been secretive about his private life, had a cabin somewhere on the mountain that he'd never let her visit, had been inexplicably unavailable on certain weekends throughout their relationship. The circumstantial evidence was building, but Detective Chun needed something concrete. Something that would justify an arrest warrant. Something that would hold up in court. She decided to bring Matias in for another interview. Not as a suspect, not officially, but as someone who might have information relevant to this new development. On April 30th, 2014, Matias Brandt sat across from Detective Sarah Chun in an interrogation room in Denver. He'd come voluntarily, agreed to answer questions, waived his right to an attorney. Confident. Maybe too confident. Matias, we've recovered items belonging to Analisa and Lena Lightner from a collapsed cabin approximately 3 miles from Silver Fir Resort. Do you know anything about this cabin? There are lots of old structures up there, Matias replied calmly. I've come across abandoned cabins and sheds during trail maintenance over the years. If I saw something like that, I'd report it to the Forest Service. Did you report this particular cabin? I don't know which cabin you're talking about specifically. The one where we found your jacket, Matias. That's when his expression changed. Just for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty, of calculation. Then the calm mask returned. I lost a jacket years ago. Could have been taken from my locker at the resort. Could have been stolen from my truck. I don't see how that connects to this. Detective Chun leaned forward. We also found evidence that someone was held in this cabin for an extended period. Food supplies, chains, DNA evidence that we're currently analyzing. When those results come back, Matias, where do you think they're going to point? Matias stood up. I think I'd like that lawyer now. The interview was over, but the investigation was just beginning. After Matias Brandt invoked his right to an attorney, Detective Sarah Chun knew the clock was ticking. She had maybe 48 hours before his lawyer would advise him to disappear, to destroy evidence, to lawyer up completely. She needed to move fast. She assembled a specialized task force. This time, it included FBI agents with expertise in kidnapping cases, forensic specialists, digital forensics experts, and a prosecutor from the district attorney's office to ensure every step they took would hold up in court. The first priority was completing the DNA analysis from the cabin. The lab worked overtime, and within 36 hours, they had preliminary results. DNA recovered from hair samples in the cabin matched both Analisa and Lena Lightner. They'd been there, probably for extended periods based on the quantity and distribution of biological evidence found throughout the structure. More significantly, they found male DNA that didn't match any existing profiles in the criminal database, but it was present on the chains, on food wrappers, on various surfaces throughout the cabin. Someone had been there regularly, bringing supplies, maintaining the prison. They needed a comparison sample from Matias Brandt. Under normal circumstances, they'd need consent or a warrant. But Matias had drunk from a water bottle during his interview and left it in the interrogation room. The water bottle was now evidence, and the DNA they extracted from it would be their Rosetta Stone. The match came back at 99.98% certainty. Matias Brandt had been in that cabin. His DNA was all over the crime scene. But DNA evidence placing him at the cabin still didn't prove he'd kidnapped anyone. His attorney could argue he'd been there for legitimate reasons, found the abandoned structure, maybe even tried to help victims he'd discovered there. It was a weak argument, but reasonable doubt was a powerful thing. Detective Chun needed more. She needed to understand the full scope of what Matias had done, and she needed to figure out where Analisa and Lena were now. The FBI's digital forensics team obtained a warrant for Matias Brandt's electronic devices and property. On May 3, 2014, federal agents executed search warrants at Matias's apartment in town and his personal vehicle. What they found was damning. On his laptop, hidden in encrypted folders that took forensic experts 2 days to crack, were hundreds of photographs. Images of young girls at the resort, taken candidly without their knowledge. Close-ups of children in ski gear. Screenshots from the resort's security cameras showing families checking in, with handwritten notes about room numbers and lengths of stay. There were detailed files on multiple families who'd stayed at Silver Fir over the years. Matias had been watching, recording, planning. The Lightners weren't his first obsession, just the one he'd acted on. Most horrifying were the recent photos, images from within the past 2 years showing a teenage girl with long dark hair, thin, pale, obviously held somewhere against her will. The photos were in a folder labeled only with a date, February 9, 2007. The FBI showed these photos to Jakob Lightner. He collapsed when he saw them. The girl in the photos was older, traumatized, barely recognizable, but the eyes were unmistakable. "That's Lena," he whispered. "My God, that's my daughter. She's alive. She's alive and he has her." The photos' metadata showed they'd been taken with Matias's phone at various dates over the past 7 years, with the most recent dated April 15, 2014, just 8 days before the hikers found the collapsed cabin. This meant Lena was alive as of 2 weeks ago. Somewhere. Held by a monster who'd stolen 7 years of her childhood. But where was she now? And where was Analisa? The FBI's geographic profiling team analyzed the photos, looking for clues about the location. The backgrounds showed wooden walls, a concrete floor in some images, electrical wiring visible in others. This wasn't the collapsed mountain cabin. This was somewhere else. Somewhere more permanent, possibly with electricity. One photo showed a small window in the background. Through that window, barely visible, was a glimpse of mountain landscape. The forensic team enhanced the image, compared the mountain profile to topographical maps of the region. They narrowed the possible locations to a 3-mile radius from Silver Fir Resort. Detective Chun looked at property records for that area. There were dozens of structures, residential homes, utility buildings, storage facilities, old mining structures. They'd need days to search them all, and they didn't have days. If Matias suspected they were closing in, he might do something desperate. Jakob Lightner had been kept informed of every development. He'd been cooperative, patient, trusting law enforcement to handle the investigation properly. But when he learned they had photos proving Lena was alive, something inside him shifted. He knew that mountain better than anyone except possibly Matias. He'd spent 7 years searching every inch of accessible terrain. But he'd always focused on outdoor locations, assuming his family was lost or deceased in the wilderness. He'd never considered they might be hidden in plain sight, in a structure somewhere close to the resort. Jakob started thinking about places Matias had access to. Storage buildings on resort property. Old equipment sheds. The maintenance tunnels beneath the main lodge that dated back to the resort's original construction in the 1960s. The tunnels. Why hadn't he thought of that before? The resort had an extensive network of underground maintenance tunnels connecting various buildings, originally built to allow staff to move supplies and equipment during heavy winter weather. Most of the tunnels were still used, but some sections had been sealed off years ago due to structural concerns or because they led to demolished buildings. Jakob had keys to the accessible tunnels, but the sealed sections? He'd never been in those areas. They'd been closed off before he'd purchased the resort. He mentioned this to Detective Chen during one of their regular updates. She immediately saw the potential. "Can you show me these tunnels? Today?" Within 2 hours, Jakob, Detective Chun, 3 FBI agents, and a structural engineer were descending into the resort's basement. Jakob led them through the maintenance areas, past furnaces and storage rooms, to a heavy metal door marked with old warning signs about structural instability. The door was supposed to be sealed, welded shut according to resort records. But when they examined it closely, they found fresh scratches around the frame. The sealed door actually opened. Someone had cut through the welds and made it functional again while making it appear closed. Beyond that door was a tunnel stretching into darkness. The structural engineer tested the air quality, safe to proceed. They pulled on respirators just in case and ventured forward, flashlights cutting through the decades-old dust. The tunnel descended deeper than Jakob had realized possible, the walls showing evidence of hand-cut expansion. Someone had been working down here, making more space, creating rooms off the main corridor. After about 200 feet, they found another door. This one newer, solid, with a serious lock. Detective Chun called for a locksmith and backup. She wasn't going any further without serious support. Within 30 minutes, a full tactical team was in position. This could be where Matias was holding Lena. This could be where it all ended. The locksmith worked for 20 minutes before the mechanism gave way. The tactical team entered first, weapons ready, flashlights sweeping the darkness. What they found was a chamber of horrors. A living space had been constructed in this underground room. There was a cot, a chemical toilet, shelves with food supplies and water bottles. There were books, stacks of them, mostly aimed at teenagers. There was a small television with a DVD player, probably powered by an extension cord running through the tunnels from the resort's electrical system. And there were chains mounted to the concrete wall. Heavy chains with padlocks, recently used based on the wear patterns. But no one was there. The room was empty. Detective Chen's radio crackled. "Detective, we've got movement up top. Suspect Matias Brandt just arrived at the resort parking lot." He's heading for the main building. Jakob's face went pale. If he knows we're down here, if he's come back. He might have Lena with him, Detective Chen finished. She barked orders into her radio. All units, converge on the main lodge. Suspect is potentially armed and has a hostage. Do not let him reach the tunnels. They ran back through the tunnel, hearts pounding, flashlights bouncing off the walls. Behind them, the evidence team would process the underground prison. Ahead of them, a confrontation was about to happen that would finally bring this nightmare to its conclusion. 7 years of searching, 7 years of questions. And now, in one chaotic moment, everything was about to collide. Matias Brandt's pickup truck screeched into Silver Fir Resort's parking lot at 3:47 p.m. on May 3, 2014. He parked erratically, taking up 2 spaces, and practically ran toward the main lodge. FBI agents positioned at the entrance immediately moved to intercept him. But Matias was fast, fueled by panic and desperation. He made it through the front doors before they could react. Federal agents, stop where you are. But Matias didn't stop. He sprinted through the lobby, staff and guests scattering in confusion and fear. He was heading for the service corridor that led to the basement. Heading for his underground prison. He didn't know that Detective Chen and her team were already there, already coming up from below. They met at the intersection of the service corridor and the main basement stairs. Matias turned the corner and ran directly into Jakob Lightner and 2 FBI agents. Matias, it's over, Jakob said, his voice shaking but firm. We found it. We found where you kept them. For a moment, Matias just stood there, breathing hard, weighing his options. Then he turned and ran in the opposite direction, toward the resort's rear exit. But he'd forgotten or never knew about the tactical team that had taken positions around the entire building. The moment he burst through the back door, he was tackled by 3 agents, face first into the melting spring snow. Where is she? Detective Chen was there instantly, kneeling beside Matias as agents cuffed his hands behind his back. Where's Lena? Where's Analisa? Matias said nothing, just glared at her with cold, dead eyes. We found your photo collection, Matias. We found the underground room. We have your DNA all over the mountain cabin. We have enough to put you away for the rest of your life. But if you tell us where they are right now, if they're alive, the prosecutor might show leniency. This is your only chance. Still nothing. Jakob pushed through the crowd of agents, dropped to his knees beside Matias. Please, please, whatever you've done, whatever your reasons, just tell me where my family is. Is Lena alive? Is Analisa? Please, I'm begging you. Something flickered in Matias's expression. Not remorse, something else. Satisfaction? Pride? The look of someone who held power and knew it. You want to know? Matias finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. You really want to know what happened to your perfect family? Yes, Jakob whispered. Then let me show you. This threw everyone off guard. Detective Chen exchanged glances with the lead FBI agent. This could be a trick, a delay tactic, an attempt to escape. But it could also be their only chance to find Lena alive. You're going to tell us where they are and we're going to send a team, Detective Chen said firmly. No, Matias replied. You need to see it. You need to understand what you've been so close to all these years. The resort owner, the great Jakob Lightner, searching the mountain while his daughter was right here, right under his feet the entire time. That confirmation that Lena had been held at the resort hit Jakob like a physical blow. 7 years of searching distant mountains, of organizing volunteers to scour remote trails, and she'd been here, at his resort, while he walked above, unaware. They agreed to let Matias lead them, but under extreme security. He was kept in handcuffs, surrounded by agents, guns drawn. If this was a trap, it would be a very short-lived one. Matias led them back into the resort, through the basement, past the tunnel entrance they'd already discovered. But then he took them to a different area entirely, the old section of the resort that had been closed to guests for years, awaiting renovations that Jakob had never been able to afford. Behind a utility closet, behind false shelving that looked like it had been there forever, was another door. This one was hidden so well that even Jakob, who'd owned the resort for 12 years, had never known it existed. Beyond that door was a narrow staircase descending even deeper. And at the bottom, another tunnel, this one much older, carved directly through bedrock, probably dating back to the resort's original construction or even earlier, possibly a mining tunnel from before the resort existed. The air was cold, damp, oppressive. Their footsteps echoed off stone walls. Matias walked calmly, as if taking guests on a tour of his domain. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 minutes, the tunnel opened into a larger space. A natural cave that had been modified and expanded. There was evidence of electrical work, lights strung along the walls, a generator humming in the corner. And there, in that underground chamber, was what Matias wanted them to see. A teenage girl was huddled in the corner, chained to the wall but with enough length to move around a small living area. She was painfully thin, pale as paper, long dark hair hanging in tangles around her face. When the flashlights hit her, she flinched, covering her eyes. "Lena," Jakob's voice broke. The girl looked up slowly. Her eyes, Analisa's eyes, focused on Jakob. For a moment there was no recognition. 7 years was an eternity for a child. She'd been 10 when she was taken. She was 17 now, shaped by trauma into something Jakob almost didn't recognize. But then something clicked. "Dad." The word was barely audible, rusty from disuse or fear or disbelief. Jakob lunged forward, but agents held him back. "Let me go to her. That's my daughter." "Not yet," Detective Chun said firmly. "The scene needs to be secured first. Matias, where are the keys to those chains?" Matias smiled. "In my truck. Glove compartment." An agent was immediately radioed to retrieve them. Meanwhile, Detective Chun approached Lena carefully, hands visible, voice gentle. "Lena, my name is Detective Sarah Chun. You're safe now. We're gonna get you out of here. Is anyone else down here with you?" Lena's eyes darted to a darker section of the chamber, where the shadows were deepest. Detective Chun aimed her flashlight in that direction. There, on a cot against the far wall, was another figure, motionless, a woman with long hair, covered with blankets. "Analisa," Detective Chun called out. No response. Medical personnel had been standing by. They were radioed in immediately, bringing equipment, making their way through the tunnels as fast as possible. Detective Chun approached the cot carefully. The woman was breathing shallow, labored breaths. She was alive but unconscious or unresponsive. "How long has she been like this?" Detective Chun asked Lena. 3 days, Lena replied, her voice flat, emotionless. "She got sick. He said he'd bring medicine, but he never came back until today." Matias stood there, still surrounded by agents, watching the scene unfold with that same eerie calm. "Why?" Jakob demanded, tears streaming down his face. "Why would you do this? We were friends. I trusted you." "Why?" Matias turned to look at him. "You had everything I wanted. The resort, the respect, the perfect family. And you didn't even appreciate it. You took it all for granted. So you destroyed it? You took my wife and daughter and kept them prisoner for 7 years. "I kept them," Matias corrected. "They were mine. I took care of them. I fed them, gave them books and entertainment, kept them safe from the world. They were happy here once they accepted it." "Happy?" Jakob's voice rose to a shout. "You kept them in chains underground." The medical team arrived, immediately attending to Analisa. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, showing signs of infection. They started in 4-line, prepared her for transport to the surface. For Lena, they brought bolt cutters for the chains, blankets for warmth, water for her parched throat. She drank slowly, mechanically, her eyes never leaving her father's face. "I'm so sorry," Jakob kept repeating, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I looked for you. I never stopped looking." "I know," Lena said quietly. "Sometimes I could hear the searches, people calling my name. I screamed and screamed, but no one heard me down here." The weight of that statement crushed everyone in the chamber. 7 years of being so close yet impossibly far from rescue. As medics worked on Lena and Analisa, investigators documented everything. Photographs of the living conditions, the chains, the evidence of long-term captivity. Matias's underground kingdom was being catalogued in excruciating detail. In one corner, they found notebooks, journals that Matias had kept, documenting his time with his family as he'd come to think of them. Pages and pages of delusional ramblings about how he was protecting them, how they belonged to him, how this was better than the superficial life they'd led before. In another corner, they found the boots, multiple pairs of ski boots that Matias used for his instruction work. But some of these boots had been modified, tiny cameras embedded in the toes, disguised as decorative elements or repair patches. This explained part of his method. He'd been filming the guests, particularly families with young daughters, during ski lessons. He'd been selecting targets, gathering information, planning his moves. And the Lightners had been his ultimate target. The family that had everything he'd ever wanted. "Did you plan this from the beginning?" Detective Chun asked. "When Jakob hired you 6 years before the abduction?" Matias actually laughed. "No, that came later. I liked working at the resort. I was good at my job. But watching their happiness, it started to eat at me. I deserved that life. I deserved to be appreciated, to have a family. So I decided to take it." "And Analisa?" Jakob demanded. "What did you do to her?" "She was difficult at first," Matias said casually, as if discussing a minor inconvenience. "Wouldn't accept the situation. Kept trying to escape, to hurt me, to hurt herself. So I had to be firm. Discipline. Eventually she understood." The casual way he described 7 years of torture and imprisonment was more chilling than any dramatic confession could have been. Analisa was placed on a stretcher, still unconscious. The medics were concerned. She needed a hospital immediately, intensive care, treatment for infections and malnutrition. Her survival was far from guaranteed. Lena was given a medical evaluation on site. Physically, she was malnourished, dehydrated, showing signs of abuse and neglect. But she was conscious, responsive, able to walk with assistance. Psychologically, the damage would take years to even begin to assess. As they prepared to transport both victims to the surface and then to Denver Memorial Hospital, Jakob approached Lena one more time. "I'm here now," he said, taking her hand carefully, afraid she might pull away. "I'm never letting you out of my sight again. Never." Lena looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, endured too much. "I tried to remember you," she whispered. "Every day. I tried to remember what you looked like, what your voice sounded like. After a while, it got harder." "I'm real," Jakob assured her. "This is real. You're safe now. He can never hurt you again." Matias was led away in handcuffs, agents gripping his arms firmly. As he passed Jakob, he leaned close and whispered something that only Jakob could hear. Jakob's face went white. He lunged at Matias, but agents pulled him back. "What did he say?" Detective Chun demanded. Jakob was shaking with rage. He said, 7 years I gave them more attention than you ever did. The absolute delusion, the twisted logic, the complete lack of remorse. It was all on full display. Matias Brandt was placed in a police transport vehicle, facing charges that would keep him in prison for the rest of his natural life. Multiple counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, child abuse, assault, and the list was still growing as investigators cataloged his crimes. The smoking gun wasn't one single piece of evidence. It was the entire underground horror show he'd constructed. The photos, the journals, the DNA evidence, the victims themselves. The case was airtight. There would be no escape, no legal technicality, no way out. 7 years of darkness were finally giving way to light. The arrest of Matias Brandt on May 3, 2014, sent shockwaves through the Silver Fir community that were felt for months afterward. This was the man who'd taught their children to ski, who'd smiled and laughed and seemed so normal, who'd searched alongside them when Analisa and Lena first disappeared, tears in his eyes, calling out their names. The monster had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. Matias was transported to the Denver County Jail and formally booked at 7:35 p.m. that evening. The charges read like a horror novel. 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping, 2 counts of false imprisonment, multiple counts of child abuse, assault, sexual assault of a child, and the list continued to grow as investigators uncovered more evidence. His bail hearing was held the following morning. The prosecution argued, successfully, that Matias Brandt posed an extreme flight risk and a danger to society. Bail was denied. He would remain in custody until trial. The media coverage was intense and immediate. Within hours of the arrest, news vans filled Silver Fir's parking lot. National networks picked up the story. The case had everything the media loved: a photogenic victim family, a years-long mystery, a shocking resolution, and a villain straight out of a nightmare. Monster Next Door, the Silver Fir ski resort kidnapping case, ran on every major news outlet. Reporters tried to interview anyone who'd ever known Matias, anyone who'd worked with him, anyone who could provide insight into how a man could commit such crimes while appearing so ordinary. The community reaction was complex. Shock, certainly. Horror at what had been happening literally beneath their feet. But also guilt, crushing, overwhelming guilt. Parents whose children had taken lessons from Matias felt sick. "I let my daughter spend hours alone with that man," one mother told local news, breaking down in tears. "I thought he was trustworthy. How could we not have known?" Rebecca Torres, who'd worked alongside Matias for years, struggled to reconcile the colleague she'd known with the monster he'd actually been. "He was always so professional, so good with the kids," she said in an interview. "There were no warning signs. Or if there were, we all missed them. How do you live with that?" The answer was, you didn't live with it easily. Detective Sarah Chun held a press conference 2 days after the arrest, providing details that could be shared without compromising the upcoming trial. Matias Brandt meticulously planned and executed the abduction of Analisa and Lena Lightner on February 9, 2007, she explained to the assembled media. He used his position as a ski instructor and his intimate knowledge of the resort to hold them captive in hidden underground chambers for 7 years. Detective Chun, how did he manage to keep them hidden for so long? The chambers were located in abandoned sections of the resort's tunnel system that even the owner wasn't aware existed. Matias had clearly spent years preparing these locations, making them livable, ensuring they couldn't be discovered accidentally. What about Analisa Lightner's condition? Detective Chen's expression darkened. "Mrs. Lightner is in critical but stable condition at Denver Memorial Hospital. She's receiving treatment for severe malnutrition, multiple infections, and other complications resulting from her captivity. Her prognosis is guarded, but doctors are cautiously optimistic." And Lena Lightner is 17 years old now. She's receiving comprehensive medical and psychological care. She's with her father, and the family has requested privacy as they begin the long process of healing. One reporter called out, "Detective, there are reports that Matias Brandt had been planning similar crimes targeting other families. Can you confirm?" "I can confirm that we recovered evidence suggesting Mr. Brandt had been surveilling multiple families over the years. We're investigating whether there may be additional victims. Anyone with information is encouraged to contact our tip line." That statement sent another wave of fear through communities across Colorado. How many other families had been on Matias's radar? Had he acted on any other plans? The FBI's investigation expanded to include a review of missing persons cases in areas where Matias had previously lived or worked. He'd moved around quite a bit before settling at Silver Fir in 2001. Different ski resorts in Colorado and Utah, always working as an instructor, always around families and children. 3 cold cases with similar patterns, families or children who disappeared from ski resort areas, were flagged for further investigation. None could be definitively linked to Matias yet, but the timeline and geography were concerning. Meanwhile, at the Denver County Jail, Matias maintained his eerie calm. His attorney, a public defender named Graham Walsh who'd been assigned to the case, found his client disturbingly rational and completely unrepentant. "He genuinely believes he did nothing wrong," Walsh told colleagues, off the record. "In his mind, He rescued Analisa and Lena from a mediocre life and gave them purpose by allowing them to be part of his world. He's delusional, clearly, but he's not insane in the legal sense. He knows what he did. He just doesn't see it as wrong. This would become a central issue in the case. Matias Brandt was sane enough to stand trial, competent enough to participate in his own defense, but morally bankrupt in ways that defied normal human understanding. The discovery of the hidden camera-equipped ski boots led to another disturbing revelation. Investigators recovered hundreds of hours of footage from Matias's encrypted hard drives. Videos of children during ski lessons, shot from the perspective of his boot cameras, focusing on angles that were undeniably predatory. None of the footage showed actual abuse. These were taken during legitimate lessons with parents often visible in the background, but the intent was clear. Matias had been collecting this material for years, creating a library of potential targets. The FBI contacted every family that could be identified from the footage. It was a devastating task, calling parents to inform them that their children had been unknowingly filmed by a predator. Some families had vacationed at Silver Fir years ago and had long since moved on with their lives. Now they had to confront the fact that their vacation memories were tainted by evil they'd never suspected. Jakob Lightner was, of course, destroyed by the revelation that this had all happened at his own resort, in his own building. The place he'd built as a dream for his family had become their prison. "I'm shutting it down," he told Rebecca Torres in those first days after the arrest. "I can't run this place anymore. I can't ask people to come here after what happened." Rebecca understood, but she also worried about Jakob's state of mind. He'd spent 7 years searching, barely holding on to hope. Now that Lena was found, now that Analisa was fighting for her life in a hospital, the emotional whiplash was tremendous. He needed to focus on his family, not on guilt and self-recrimination. But guilt wasn't something you could just set aside. The community, meanwhile, struggled with its own collective guilt. How had no one noticed? How had Matias operated for 7 years without a single slip-up that revealed his crime? The truth was uncomfortable. He'd been smart. He'd planned meticulously. He'd chosen victims he had access to and a location he could control. He'd maintained his normal life so well that even people who knew him closely saw nothing suspicious. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a friendly face and a ski instructor's jacket and waves at you in the morning. On May 7th, for days after the arrest, Jakob received permission to visit Analisa in the hospital. She'd regained consciousness the day before but remained weak, heavily medicated, drifting in and out of lucidity. When she saw Jakob, tears streamed down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Why are you sorry?" Jakob was crying too, holding her hand like he'd never let go. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. I couldn't protect her. I couldn't stop him. I tried, Jakob. I tried so hard. I know you did. You survived. You both survived. That's what matters." Analisa closed her eyes. 7 years. He took 7 years from us. "We'll get them back," Jakob promised, though he had no idea how to keep such a promise. "We'll heal. We'll be a family again." Analisa squeezed his hand weakly. "Is Lena?" "She's safe. She's strong. She's with a counselor right now starting therapy. She asks about you constantly. She wants to see you as soon as the doctors say it's okay. Tell her I love her. Tell her I never stopped fighting to keep us alive. She knows. She knows, my love." The arrest had happened. The monster was in custody. But the hard part, the healing, the recovery, the rebuilding of shattered lives, that was only just beginning. And there was still a trial ahead. Justice demanded its day in court. The trial of Matias Brandt began on September 15, 2014, in the Denver District Court. It had been 4 months since his arrest. 4 months that prosecutors had used to build an absolutely overwhelming case. And 4 months that Analisa and Lena Lightner had used to begin their long journey toward recovery. Jury selection alone took 3 days. The case had received so much media attention that finding impartial jurors was nearly impossible. Eventually, a jury of 7 women and 5 men was seated. People who'd heard about the case but felt they could judge based solely on the evidence presented in court. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Sandra Martinez, a veteran prosecutor known for her meticulous preparation and compassionate handling of trauma victims. Her opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a predator who stole 7 years from 2 innocent people. Analisa Lightner was 34 years old, happily married, a loving mother, a respected member of her community. Lena Lightner was 10 years old, a bright, joyful child with her whole life ahead of her. On February 9, 2007, the defendant, Matias Brandt, abducted both of them and held them prisoner in underground chambers beneath the Silver Fir ski resort. For 7 years. 7 years of chains and darkness and unspeakable cruelty. The evidence you will see and hear over the course of this trial will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Matias Brandt is guilty of every charge brought against him. The defense attorney, Graham Walsh, faced an impossible task. His opening statement was brief. The defense does not dispute that Analisa and Lena Lightner were held captive. The defense does not dispute that my client was responsible. What we ask is that you consider the question of mental capacity and state of mind. The evidence will show that Matias Brandt suffers from severe psychological disorders that impaired his ability to understand the wrongfulness of his actions. It was an insanity defense, the only possible strategy given the mountain of evidence against Matias. The prosecution called 43 witnesses over the course of 3 weeks. The testimony painted a comprehensive picture of Matias Brandt's crimes and the impact on his victims. Detective Sarah Chun testified about the investigation, walking the jury through 7 years of dead ends and the eventual breakthrough. She described finding the collapsed mountain cabin, discovering the hidden chambers beneath the resort, and the moment they found Lena and Analisa alive. FBI forensic specialists testified about the DNA evidence that irrefutably placed Matias at all the crime scenes. They explained the analysis of the camera-equipped ski boots, the encrypted files on his computer, and the disturbing journals where he documented his crimes. Medical experts testified about the physical condition of the victims when they were recovered. The testimony was difficult to hear: malnutrition, untreated infections, injuries consistent with restraint and abuse. Analisa had suffered multiple broken bones over the years that had healed improperly without medical attention. Lena showed signs of severe psychological trauma and developmental delays consistent with prolonged isolation and abuse. Former colleagues and acquaintances testified about Matias's behavior in the years leading up to and following the abduction. Several people mentioned that he'd seemed unusually interested in families with young daughters, that he'd asked inappropriate questions about guests' personal information, that he'd sometimes disappeared during his shifts with vague explanations. One particularly damning witness was Harold Pemberton, the Texas retiree who'd seen someone loading equipment late at night the evening of the abduction. He testified that after seeing photos of Matias, he was reasonably certain he was the man he'd seen that night, the man who'd been moving nervously, looking over his shoulder, clearly hiding something. The most anticipated and dreaded testimony came from the victims themselves. Analisa Lightner took the stand on the trial's 16th day. She was noticeably thin, still recovering physically, but her voice was clear and strong as she was sworn in. District Attorney Martinez led her through the questioning gently. "Mrs. Lightner, can you tell the jury what happened on the evening of February 9th, 2007? Analisa took a deep breath. "Lena and I had dinner at the resort restaurant around 6 p.m. We went back to our room to get ready for the next day of skiing. Around 8 p.m., there was a knock on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw Matias. I knew him, he worked at the resort, taught Lena skiing. I thought maybe Jakob had sent him with a message. What happened when you opened the door?" He forced his way in. He had something in his hand. I later realized it was a stun gun. He used it on me. I remember the pain, falling down, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in darkness, chained to a wall. Lena was beside me, crying, terrified. "How long were you held captive?" 7 years, 2 months, and 24 days. The specificity of that answer hit the courtroom hard. Every single day had mattered to Analisa. "Can you describe the conditions of your captivity?" Analisa's testimony lasted 3 hours. She described the underground chambers, the chains, the minimal food and water provided, the complete isolation from the outside world. She described Matias's visits, sometimes daily, sometimes absent for days at a time, and his delusional belief that he was caring for them, that they were his family. She described trying to protect Lena, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, reading to her daughter by flashlight, teaching her math and history from memory, singing her to sleep at night even as they both shivered in the cold darkness. There were times I wanted to give up, Analisa testified, her voice breaking, times when the pain and despair were so overwhelming that I just wanted it to end. But I couldn't, not while Lena needed me, so I survived. We both survived. And every single day, I prayed that Jakob was still looking for us, that somehow, someday we'd be found. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. Jurors, spectators, even the bailiff wiping tears from his eyes. The defense's cross-examination was brief and respectful. Walsh knew better than to aggressively question a victim who'd endured what Analisa had endured. It would only turn the jury more firmly against his client. Lena Lightner's testimony was even more difficult. Now 17 years old, she testified via closed-circuit television due to her age and the nature of the charges. The jury could see and hear her, but she didn't have to face Matias directly. Lena, you were 10 years old when you were abducted. Can you tell the jury what you remember about that night? Lena's voice was soft, but steady. She'd been preparing for this moment with her therapist for months. I remember being in the hotel room with my mom. I remember someone at the door. Then I remember being in a dark place, scared, calling for my dad. But he didn't come. The man, Matias, he told me that my dad didn't want us anymore, that we belonged to him now, that we'd be his family. Did you believe that? At first, I didn't. I knew my dad loved us. But after months, then years, I started to forget what my dad looked like. I started to forget what life was like before. The man would bring me books and tell me I was his daughter now. It was confusing. I was just a kid. I didn't understand what was real anymore. The psychological manipulation of a child over 7 years was evident in her testimony. Matias hadn't just imprisoned Lena physically. He tried to imprison her mind, to replace her real family with a distorted fantasy where he played the role of her caretaker. What kept you going during those years? My mom. She never let me forget who we really were. She'd tell me stories about my dad, about our life at the resort, about all the people who loved us. Even when I started to doubt, she'd remind me. She saved me in more ways than just keeping me alive. The prosecution rested after 21 days of testimony. The evidence was overwhelming: physical evidence, testimonial evidence, documentary evidence. There was no question that Matias Brandt had committed these crimes. The defense's case was focused entirely on mental health. They called psychiatrists who'd evaluated Matias, experts who testified about various personality disorders and delusional conditions. One psychiatrist diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder with delusional features. Another suggested he had an attachment disorder stemming from childhood trauma. A third theorized about possible brain abnormalities that could affect impulse control and empathy. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They called their own psychiatric experts who testified that while Matias certainly had psychological issues, he was legally sane. He knew his actions were wrong, evidenced by the elaborate steps he'd taken to hide his crimes. He was capable of controlling his behavior, evidenced by the fact that he'd maintained a normal public life for 7 years while committing these crimes in secret. Legal insanity requires that a person cannot distinguish right from wrong, or cannot control their actions due to mental disease, the prosecution's expert explained. Mr. Brandt clearly knew what he was doing was illegal and immoral. He went to extraordinary lengths to avoid detection. That demonstrates both knowledge of wrongfulness and behavioral control. He's not insane. He's a calculating predator. The defense rested after only 4 days of testimony. There wasn't much they could do. The facts were undeniable, and the insanity defense was a weak reed to lean on. Closing arguments were scheduled for October 9th. District Attorney Martinez spoke first, reminding the jury of everything they'd heard and seen. The defendant stole 7 years from Analisa Lightner. 7 years from Lena Lightner. 7 years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary family moments. 7 years of freedom and sunshine and human connection. He kept them in darkness and chains because of his own twisted desires. This wasn't insanity. This was evil, pure and calculated. When you deliberate, remember Lena's voice describing how she slowly forgot her father's face. Remember Analisa describing the broken bones that healed wrong because she received no medical care. Remember the chains, the camera-equipped boots, the journals where he described his victims as possessions. And then deliver the verdict that justice demands. Guilty on all counts. Graham Walsh's closing was somber. No one is disputing the horror of what happened to the Lightner family. But justice isn't just about punishment, it's about understanding. My client is a deeply disturbed individual who needs psychiatric treatment, not just incarceration. When you deliberate, consider whether he had the mental capacity to truly understand the magnitude of his crimes. It was a valiant effort, but even Walsh seemed to know it was futile. The jury received the case at 2 p.m. on October 9th. They deliberated for 6 hours that day, returned the next morning, and reached a verdict by noon. The courtroom was packed when the jury foreman stood to read the verdict. Jakob sat with Analisa and Lena, all three holding hands, bracing for whatever came next. In the matter of the state of Colorado versus Matias Brandt, on the charge of first-degree kidnapping of Analisa Lightner, we the jury find the defendant guilty. There were audible gasps, then suppressed cheers from the gallery. On the charge of first-degree kidnapping of Lena Lightner, we the jury find the defendant guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Count after count. Guilty. 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 When it was over, Matias Brandt had been convicted on 18 separate counts. He showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead with those dead, cold eyes. The Lightner family wept, tears of relief, grief, and exhausted vindication. Justice had spoken. Now it was time for sentencing. Sentencing was scheduled for October 30th, 2014. 3 weeks after the guilty verdicts, the courtroom assembled once again to determine what punishment Matias Brandt would receive for his crimes. Colorado law allowed for victim impact statements before sentencing. District Attorney Sandra Martinez had prepared the Lightner family for this moment. Their chance to speak directly to the man who destroyed their lives, to tell him and the court exactly what he'd taken from them. Judge Helena Morrison presided, a veteran jurist known for her measured temperament and commitment to justice. She'd sat through the entire trial without showing visible emotion, but those who knew her could see the anger simmering beneath her professional composure. Before this court proceeds to sentencing, Judge Morrison began, I will hear from the victims. Mrs. Lightner, if you wish to address the court, you may do so now. Analisa Lightner stood, supported by Jakob on one side and Rebecca Torres on the other. She'd prepared a written statement but had decided, ultimately, to speak from the heart. Your Honor, I've spent months trying to find the right words to explain what was taken from me, from us. But there aren't words adequate to describe 7 years of hell. 7 years of believing I would never see sunlight again, never feel wind on my face, never hear my husband's voice. She turned to face Matias directly. He refused to look at her, staring instead at the table in front of him. You stole my daughter's childhood. Lena was 10 years old, 10 when you took her. She should have been going to school dances, playing soccer, learning to drive, experiencing all the normal milestones of growing up. Instead, she was chained in darkness, being told lies about her family, being manipulated and abused by someone she'd trusted. Analisa's voice grew stronger, anger replacing sorrow. You stole my identity. I was a wife, a mother, a businesswoman, a friend. You reduced me to a possession, a thing you kept in a cage. You broke bones in my body that will never heal correctly. You gave me nightmares that will haunt me for the rest of my life. But here's what you didn't take, Matias. You didn't take our will to survive. You didn't take our love for each other. You didn't break our spirits, no matter how hard you tried. We survived you. We escaped your control. And we will heal and rebuild and eventually thrive. while you spend the rest of your miserable life in a cage that you deserve." She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I ask that this court impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. This man is a danger to society and a predator who will never stop if given the chance. He needs to be locked away forever." Analisa sat down, trembling. Jakob held her, whispering words of support. Next, Lena Lightner stood. At 17, still recovering, still fragile in so many ways, she nonetheless faced the court with remarkable courage. "I'm 17 now. I should be a senior in high school thinking about prom and graduation and college. Instead, I'm relearning how to be a person. I'm learning that the world isn't a dark underground prison. I'm learning to trust people again, even though trusting someone once led to 7 years of captivity." Her voice wavered but didn't break. "He took my childhood. He took years I can never get back. He tried to make me forget my real family, my real life, my real name. Some days I'm so angry about that I can barely function. Other days, I'm just sad for the girl I was and the teenager I could have been if he hadn't stolen me." She finally looked at Matias, who still refused to meet anyone's gaze. "But I'm here. I'm alive. I'm free. And you're the one who's going to be locked away now. That's justice. That's what you deserve. I hope you spend every day of your sentence thinking about what you did, though I know you probably won't. People like you don't feel remorse. But I want you to know that we won. We survived you, and we're going to be okay eventually, while you rot in prison." Lena sat down to supportive applause from the gallery, applause that Judge Morrison allowed for a moment before gaveling for quiet. The defense attorney made a brief statement asking for mercy, citing Matias's mental health issues and requesting treatment rather than purely punitive sentencing. It was a perfunctory effort, delivered without much conviction. Then Matias Brandt himself was given the opportunity to speak. His attorney advised against it, but Matias insisted. He stood, finally making eye contact with the judge. "Your Honor, I didn't intend to hurt anyone. I genuinely believed I was providing a better life, a safe environment away from the superficial world. I cared for them. I kept them alive. That should count for something." There were outraged murmurs throughout the courtroom. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. "I understand the court doesn't agree with my perspective," Matias continued, his tone conversational, almost academic. "But perspective is subjective. What one person calls kidnapping, another might call rescue. What one calls imprisonment, another calls protection." "Mr. Brandt, that's enough," Judge Morrison said sharply. But Matias wasn't finished. "Lena calls me a monster, but I taught her to read better than she could before. I gave Analisa stability. They were mine to care for, and I did care for them in my way." "Mr. Brandt, sit down," the judge ordered. "Now." Matias sat, finally falling silent. But the damage was done. Any slim hope for leniency evaporated in the face of his complete lack of remorse. Judge Morrison took a moment to compose herself before speaking. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen many disturbing cases. But the calculated cruelty of this crime, combined with the defendant's utter lack of remorse or understanding of his victim's humanity, places this among the worst I have encountered." She looked directly at Matias. "Mr. Brandt, you were convicted on 18 counts. Each count carries its own sentencing guidelines. The prosecution has recommended consecutive sentences on the most serious charges. After reviewing the evidence, the victim impact statements, and your complete absence of remorse, I am in agreement." She consulted her notes. "On count 1, first-degree kidnapping of Analisa Lightner, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On count 2, first-degree kidnapping of Lena Lightner, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. These sentences are to run consecutively, not concurrently." She continued through the remaining counts: 15 years for false imprisonment, 25 years for child abuse, additional years for assault, for sexual assault of a child, for evidence tampering, for a dozen other crimes. When she finished, Matias Brandt had been sentenced to multiple life terms plus 185 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. "Mr. Brandt, you will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. You will die behind bars. You will never again have the opportunity to harm another innocent person. The law requires me to ask if you understand this sentence. Do you? Matias nodded once. I understand. Then this court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. In the gallery, the Lightner family held each other and cried, relief, exhaustion, grief for the lost years, but also hope for the future. It was over. The trial was over. Matias would never hurt anyone again. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Martinez held a brief press conference. Today, justice was served for Analisa and Lena Lightner. This case represents the worst of humanity, a predator who exploited trust to commit unthinkable crimes. But it also represents the best of humanity, a family that never gave up hope, investigators who never stopped searching, a community that rallied in support. Cold cases can be solved, predators can be caught, and victims can survive and heal. A reporter called out, "What's next for the Lightner family?" "They're going home," Martinez replied simply. "They're going to heal in privacy, surrounded by people who love them. And that's exactly what they deserve." Jakob Lightner made a brief statement of his own. "I want to thank everyone who helped bring Analisa and Lena home. Detective Chun, the FBI, the volunteers who searched, the community members who never forgot. This nightmare isn't over, healing will take years. But knowing that Matias Brandt will never hurt anyone again gives us the peace of mind we need to start that healing process." Rebecca Torres stood beside him, her own statement brief but heartfelt. "The Silver Fir community stands with the Lightners. We always have and we always will." That evening, as the sun set over the Colorado mountains, Matias Brandt was transported to Colorado State Penitentiary, where he would spend the remainder of his life in a maximum security facility. His cell was small, cold, and isolated, a fitting irony for a man who'd imprisoned others in similar conditions. The Lightner family returned to a temporary apartment in Denver. The resort remained closed. Jakob hadn't decided yet whether to reopen it, sell it, or simply let it go. That was a decision for another day. For now, they were together. For the first time in 7 years, 2 months, and 24 days, the Lightner family was under the same roof, free, safe, and looking forward instead of back. Justice had been served. The cold case was solved. The arrest had shocked the community, but it had also brought closure. Now came the hardest part, learning to live again. The Lightner case didn't end with Matias Brandt's sentencing. In many ways, that's where its real impact began, rippling outward through law enforcement practices, community awareness, and the lives of everyone it touched. In the months following the trial, Detective Sarah Chun was promoted to lieutenant and asked to head a new cold case task force specifically focused on missing persons cases in mountain resort areas. The Lightner case had revealed massive gaps in how such disappearances were investigated, and law enforcement agencies across Colorado wanted to close those gaps. "We learned that predators operate in places where people feel safe," Chin explained in a training seminar for investigators. "Ski resorts, summer camps, vacation destinations. These are areas where families let their guard down, where the environment of trust can be exploited. We need to maintain that sense of safety while also being vigilant." The task force developed new protocols for resort security. Electronic key card systems were upgraded across Colorado resorts to include more comprehensive logging and alerts for unusual access patterns. Background checks for employees were standardized and made more rigorous. Anonymous tip lines were established at every major resort. The Silver Fir ski resort itself became a case study in security failures and prevention. Even though Jakob Lightner initially intended to close it permanently, the district attorney's office asked him to reconsider. The resort could serve as a training ground for security improvements. With Rebecca Torres taking over much of the day-to-day management, the resort slowly reopened in the spring of 2015. It was renamed Mountain Hope Resort, symbolizing both a break from the past and a commitment to the future. The underground tunnels where Analisa and Lena had been held were permanently sealed with concrete. A memorial garden was planted on the resort grounds, a peaceful space with a plaque reading, "In remembrance of resilience, survival, and the unbreakable bonds of family." The broader impact on child safety protocols was significant. Ski schools across the country revised their policies about instructor-student interactions. Parents were encouraged to be more present during lessons. Security cameras were installed in changing areas and equipment rooms. The buddy system was enforced. No instructor should ever be alone with a child in an isolated area. Some critics argued these changes went too far, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that would make it harder for good instructors to do their jobs. But most parents and resort operators agreed that some inconvenience was a small price to pay for increased safety. The case also reignited discussions about missing persons investigations and cold case management. For too long, cases went cold simply because resources were limited and new emergencies constantly demanded attention. The Lightner case proved that persistence mattered, that regular review of old evidence could yield results, that families deserved better than to have their loved ones forgotten. Inspired by Detective Chen's monthly case file reviews, police departments across the country instituted similar practices. Cold cases weren't allowed to gather dust anymore. They were actively reviewed, new leads were pursued, and advances in forensic technology were applied to old evidence. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit used the Lightner case as a teaching example in their training programs. The case demonstrated how predators groom victims and communities, how they exploit trust and access, and how seemingly small behavioral anomalies can be early warning signs if properly recognized. For the Lightner family themselves, the aftermath of the trial was a complex journey. Analisa spent 9 months in intensive physical and psychological rehabilitation. She had to relearn how to trust, how to exist in open spaces without panic, how to sleep without nightmares. Her recovery was aided by a support group of other long-term captivity survivors, people who truly understood what she'd endured in ways that even well-meaning therapists couldn't fully grasp. These connections became lifelines, reminders that healing was possible even after unthinkable trauma. Lena faced her own challenges. At 17, she was simultaneously too old and too young. Too old to go back to being the 10-year-old who'd been taken, but too young to have the life experience and coping mechanisms of someone her chronological age. She enrolled in high school, working with tutors to catch up on 7 years of missed education. Some subjects came easily. She'd always been bright. Others, particularly social interactions and contemporary cultural references, were baffling. She'd missed the entire evolution of social media, the progression of technology, the shared experiences that bonded her peer group. But she persevered, supported by a phenomenal team of therapists, educators, and most importantly, her family. In a recorded interview 2 years after the trial, Lena spoke about her recovery process. People ask me what it was like to be held captive for 7 years, and I tell them I'm still figuring that out. It's not something you just get over. But every day I make choices about who I want to be. I can let what happened define me, or I can define myself despite what happened. I choose the second option. She developed an interest in psychology and counseling, hoping eventually to help other trauma survivors. The girl who'd had her childhood stolen was finding purpose in helping others reclaim theirs. Jakob Lightner became an advocate for victims' families, speaking at law enforcement conferences and community events about the importance of never giving up hope, about the resources families need when a loved one goes missing, about the long-term impacts of such crimes. The abduction was a violation, he'd say. But the aftermath, the years of not knowing, of searching, of living in limbo, that was its own kind of torture. Families of missing persons need support not just in the first days and weeks, but for years. They need to know someone still cares, someone still remembers, someone is still looking. He helped establish the Mountain State Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a nonprofit providing resources, advocacy, and support for families dealing with abductions and disappearances. The organization worked closely with law enforcement, offering investigative support and maintaining databases of cold cases. Rebecca Torres remained at Mountain Hope Resort, ensuring that the business Analisa and Jakob had built didn't die along with its painful history. Under her leadership, the resort became known not just for its slopes and amenities, but for its commitment to safety and its support of victim advocacy organizations. 5% of resort profits were donated annually to missing persons causes. Staff underwent regular training about recognizing signs of exploitation and abuse. The resort became, paradoxically, one of the safest and most conscious places for families to vacation. The case also had unexpected impacts on other investigations. The FBI's review of Matias Brandt's history and movements led to new leads in 3 other cold cases from Utah and Wyoming, young women and children who disappeared from resort areas in the early 2000s. While Matias was never definitively linked to these disappearances, he denied involvement and evidence was circumstantial. Investigators were able to reopen these cases with fresh perspectives. One case was eventually solved when new witnesses came forward after seeing Matias's trial coverage, though the perpetrator in that case turned out to be someone else entirely. The media attention around the trial and sentencing was also a double-edged sword. While it raised awareness about predatory behavior and inspired improvements in safety protocols, it also invaded the Lightner family's privacy during their most vulnerable time. Jakob had to obtain restraining orders against several tabloid journalists who harassed the family for exclusive interviews. True crime podcasters dissected every detail of the case, sometimes speculating in ways that were hurtful and inaccurate. The family's desire for privacy had to be balanced against the public interest in a case that had captured national attention. But there were positive media impacts too. Several documentary filmmakers approached the family about telling their story in a way that centered on resilience and recovery rather than sensationalizing the horror. Eventually, 2 years after the trial, the family cooperated with a documentary titled Beneath the Snow, The Lightner Family Story. The documentary focused on the investigation, the community response, and most importantly, the family's journey toward healing. It won multiple awards and was credited with generating thousands of new tips in cold cases across the country. People who'd seen something, known something, suspected something, finally finding the courage to come forward. One particularly moving moment in the documentary came when Lena, now 19, visited the sealed tunnel entrance where she'd been held. Standing in the sunlight with her parents beside her, she placed flowers at the memorial. "This isn't where my story ends," she said to the camera. "This is where it begins again. Everything before was stolen. Everything after is mine to create." The case also prompted legislative action. The Colorado legislature passed Lena's law, requiring all businesses with regular child contact to implement comprehensive background checks, security protocols, and mandatory reporting training. Similar legislation was introduced in 12 other states. Critics argued the law was too broad, that it would burden small businesses with compliance costs. But proponents, including the Lightner family, argued that child safety should always take precedence over convenience. If these protocols had existed in 2007, Jakob testified before the legislature, "Maybe Matias Brandt would have been flagged before he had the opportunity to destroy our family. Maybe other families would have been spared. That's worth whatever inconvenience businesses face." The law passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. By 2017, 3 years after Matias's conviction, the case had fundamentally changed how resort communities, law enforcement, and the general public thought about missing persons investigations and predatory behavior in trusted environments. The Lightner case solved became a landmark, not just a solved cold case, but a catalyst for systemic change. And for the family at the center of it all, life slowly, painfully, determinately moved forward. They would never be the same people they were before February 9, 2007. Too much had been lost, too much had been endured. But they were alive, they were together, and they were proof that even after 7 years of darkness, light could return. The Silver Fir Ski Resort case, or as it came to be known, the Lightner cold case, stands as one of the most disturbing yet ultimately redemptive stories in Colorado's criminal history. 7 years. That's how long Analisa and Lena Lightner lived in darkness, held captive by someone their family had trusted, in a place that should have been safe. 7 years of anguish for Jakob, who never stopped searching. 7 years of a community living with questions and guilt. But this case teaches us several crucial lessons that extend far beyond one family's tragedy. First, it reminds us that cold cases are never truly cold as long as someone cares enough to keep looking. Detective Sarah Chen's commitment to monthly case file reviews, her refusal to let the Lightners be forgotten, ultimately created the conditions for the case to be solved. Every cold case represents a family still waiting for answers, investigators who refuse to give up, and the possibility that one new piece of evidence can crack everything open. If you have information about any unsolved case, no matter how minor it might seem, no matter how much time has passed, come forward. Your tip could be the one that brings someone home. Second, the case demonstrates how predators operate by exploiting trust and familiarity. Matias Brandt wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was a respected employee, a skilled instructor, someone parents felt comfortable leaving their children with. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a friendly face and blends seamlessly into communities. This doesn't mean we should live in constant fear or suspicion, but it does mean we should be aware, vigilant, and willing to trust our instincts when something feels off. Jennifer, the former employee who mentioned feeling uncomfortable around Matias, had legitimate concerns that were dismissed as personality conflicts. In hindsight, those concerns were early warning signs. Third, the case highlights the incredible resilience of survivors. Analisa and Lena endured 7 years of captivity that would have broken many people. Yet they not only survived, they helped each other maintain their humanity, their connection to their real family, their hope for eventual rescue. Their recovery journey continues. Trauma doesn't resolve on a neat timeline just because the trial is over and the perpetrator is imprisoned. Analisa still has nightmares. Lena still struggles with trust and social connections. Jakob still carries guilt about the years he unknowingly walked above the prison where his family was held. But they're healing, they're rebuilding, they're living, and that itself is a victory over the monster who tried to steal their lives. Fourth, the case shows how communities can rally together in times of crisis. The volunteers who searched year after year. Rebecca Torres, who kept the resort running when Jakob couldn't. Marcus Williams and others who refused to let the Lightners be forgotten. The response to tragedy reveals character, and the Silver Fir community showed remarkable character. As of 2025, 11 years after Matias Brandt's conviction, the impact of this case continues to resonate. The protocols implemented in Colorado have been adopted nationwide. The Cold Case Task Force that Detective Chen leads has helped solve 47 other cases using lessons learned from the Lightner investigation. Mountain Hope Resort, formerly Silver Fir, thrives as both a ski destination and a symbol of recovery. Analisa returned to work there in 2018, taking on a role focused on guest services and community outreach. She says the resort represents everything Matias tried to destroy: family, community, joy, hope, and reclaiming it was essential to her healing. Lena graduated from the University of Colorado in 2023 with a degree in psychology. She now works with the Mountain State Center for Missing and Exploited Children, providing support to families and survivors. She's written a memoir about her experience, titled Beneath the Snow: 7 Years Lost, One Life Reclaimed, which became a bestseller and has helped countless trauma survivors feel less alone. Jakob continues his advocacy work and recently remarried, something he thought he'd never do. His new wife, whom he met at a victims advocacy conference, is a former FBI agent who understands the complicated landscape of his past. Together, they're creating a future that honors what was lost while embracing what's possible. As for Matias Brandt, he remains in Colorado State Penitentiary, where he will spend the rest of his life. In over a decade of incarceration, he has never expressed genuine remorse. He has never fully explained his motives beyond his delusional justifications. He will die in that prison, forgotten by everyone except the people whose lives he destroyed. And perhaps that's the most fitting justice, that his victims are thriving, building lives filled with meaning and purpose, while he exists in a cage, alone with his warped thoughts, remembered only as a cautionary tale about the monsters who walk among us. This case reminds us that every cold case represents not just a mystery to be solved, but real people whose lives have been shattered by violence or loss. Every case file gathering dust in a police evidence room represents a family still hoping, still waiting, still deserving answers. If you have any information about unsolved cases in your area, please come forward. Anonymous tip lines exist for a reason. Law enforcement takes every lead seriously. Your information, combined with advances in forensic technology and the dedication of investigators like Detective Chun, could be the key to solving a case that's haunted a family for years or even decades. Remember that cold cases can be solved even years later. Justice delayed is painful, but it's still justice. The arrest that shocked the silver fur community in 2014 proved that persistence, combined with new evidence and investigative advances, can crack even the most baffling cases. And remember that survivors are not defined by what was done to them, but by how they choose to live in the aftermath. Analisa, Lena, and Jakob Lightner are not victims. They're survivors, advocates, and living proof that the human spirit can endure unimaginable darkness and still find light on the other side. Their story is tragic, but it's also triumphant. 7 years were stolen, but a lifetime of healing, purpose, and hope was reclaimed. This has been the story of the Colorado cold case that shocked a community, devastated a family, and ultimately demonstrated the power of persistence, resilience, and justice. With that said, thanks for listening. Stay safe out there. Keep your loved ones close. Trust your instincts. And never stop hoping that even the coldest case can find its way to warmth. Until next time.